Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
So a couple of order rulings. Number one, if you can turn off your microphones and your cameras, it's a bit disruptive if we have on cameras or sound. The second is turn your screens to full screen. That would be a much more comfortable view for you of what's happening. Otherwise, you will see all the participants rather than just the presenter. So the other thing is that if you have a question or a comment, there is a raising your hand facility in Teams. So please use that. We'll monitor and respond if we can. And then the last thing from a legal perspective, remember that what we're doing here is not advice. Advice is always a personal thing, and we will give it in written form. So from a legal perspective, what we're doing today is not advice, but just an opinion. Now, having done all that, welcome to all of you who are logging in via the fantastic infrastructure in South Africa, where we can actually still see each other via the internet. So for all practical purposes, the national key points as far as telecoms are concerned are working properly without any interruption. So that's why we can actually have this meeting in the way that we can, in spite of insurrections and in spite of COVID. So some things are still working well. It's been a very rough 2 weeks for South Africans, and we've had many requests for an opinion on what's really happening and now what. And we thought that it would be good to just have a call and give an opinion. And what we try to do here is to keep our own emotions out of this as far as we can, and our own political opinions as far out of it as we can, but to analyze in an objective fashion what is happening. Now, the first thing that one needs to do is to say it's not 100% clear yet what actually happened over the last 2 weeks, who was involved, who pushed for what happened. But there is a framework emerging of what was happening, and I'm going to give you my best opinion as to what was happening. And the first thing is, there was clearly an initial protest against Mr. Zuma's jailing, and that was really focused on disrupting the N3 initially, saying, don't think that you can jail Mr. Zuma and it will be business as usual on the next day. So there was definitely an element of Zuma supporters making sure that there is a consequence to the actions against Mr. Zuma. So that was the start of everything, and the government handled that in a very, shall we say, non-confrontational manner. Then, of course, the chaos that ensued was used by what I would like to think of as organized criminal elements to actually go over to criminal activities, because effectively the police and the authorities were busy dealing with political, and I guess the word insurrection is fine. Apparently the president has now established that it was an insurrection. So the police was dealing with an insurrection, and criminal elements got involved in criminal activities. And then, of course, that opened the door for a third, perhaps unexpected element, and that is opportunistic looters joining in these criminal activities. So effectively, you have all of those three things going on, and it's very difficult to unscramble them. The thing to say, though, is clearly those three elements were all present, and the combination of that led to a level of lawlessness that was extremely upsetting. The very interesting thing, though, is that the journalists were reporting these lawless events without actually being attacked. So we actually had a very close view of a great many of these activities. So TV reporters would go into shops where looting is in progress. And of course, we got lots of views from social media on a variety of these activities. So what is the response to all of this? What is the conclusion from all of this? And I thought Adrian Basson from News 24 had the best response. If you look at his heading, it was "Good people of South Africa, you are on your own." So there's two elements to this. The one is, it turns out that by far the majority of South Africans don't want lawlessness and looting to take over. So what you see in the places where there were some looting is that in many of those places, the local people actually came to the aid of businesses and warehouses, etc., and prevented further looting. And also, even where there was a lot of looting, people would come out afterwards, and rainbowism, as it's now being called, showed its face in terms of the willingness of people to come out voluntarily and to help with the reaction, the cleanup. But what happened between the cleanup and the riots is that it became clear that the government, in the form of the army and the police, were extremely slow and hesitant in its reaction, and one has to say, completely incompetent. Now, for any South African, it should come as no surprise that the government, in terms of its security apparatus, is completely incompetent. I don't think the security apparatus is necessarily worse at security than Eskom is at generating electricity, or SAA is at flying in a profitable way, or than PRASA is in transporting people on urban railways, etc. So what you see is the good people of South Africa, the people who are not joining in any of these nefarious activities, which is the vast majority of South Africans, are on their own. They have to take care of themselves. The government is not in a position, either unwilling or unable, and I have to say my own assessment runs more to unable than unwilling, to actually assist and keep order. So effectively, that's what happened. There was an incident of insurrection and looting, eventually resisted by the vast majority of ordinary South Africans. That doesn't actually still, to a very large extent, get to the cause of this problem. So let's just quickly step through the alternatives. Was it an attempt to overthrow the government that failed? Now, a proper attempt to overthrow the government means that there needed to be a well-organized alternative government waiting to take over, and there was absolutely no sign of that. So, in effect, it wasn't a coup attempt in the classical sense. where the military in some countries would take over power and or a new faction would take over power and would in an organized way take over the whole government. So that was not it. The second possibility is that it was a protest against Mr. Zuma's jailing that just went further than intended, meaning it struck a raw nerve and more people joined than the protesters could have anticipated. And there are some commentators who basically say that it was never intended for this to reach the levels that it did reach, and therefore it was just an unintended consequence. But the most likely thing in my mind is that this was an attempt to destabilize the Ramaphosa government in order to replace the Ramaphosa faction in the ANC by, let's just call it the RET faction, a different faction more aligned with Mr. Zuma and more aligned with the government under the Zuma regime that lasted from 2009 to 2017. So what we've been saying for a long time is that South Africa is a very funny democracy in the sense that any actions outside the ANC have very little consequence democratically in South Africa. So to a very large extent, opposition politics are irrelevant in South Africa. What really counts is what happens within the ANC. And within the ANC, there's a 5-yearly conference. And between conferences, you have the NEC, the National Executive Committee. And whoever has the majority in the NEC, in fact, governs South Africa. So it's a very funny democracy, but it's actually an effective democracy in the sense that up to now, from 1994 until 2021, changes in power in South Africa has been peaceful. So the most important function of democracy, above all else, more important than the will of the people or any other function of democracy, it is to change power from one regime to the next without violence. Now, in that sense, over the last 2 weeks, democracy in South Africa failed for the first time. So in essence, we've had two major changes of power in South Africa. The first change of power was between Mr. Mbeki and Mr. Zuma. So from the Mandela government to the end of the Mbeki government, one could see as one faction being in power. And then there's a completely different faction within the ANC taking power, really a regime change, if you like. But it happened peacefully in 2007. So Mr. Mbeki resigned, Mr. Zuma took over, and there was no violence. So a non-violent change of regime happened in roughly 2007. But what we find is that it looked like the 2017 change of regime was also peaceful. So everything was peaceful until very recently. But the new faction under Mr. Ramaphosa has been struggling to basically consolidate its power. And to a very large extent, it was the level of criminal activity during the Zuma regime that made it extremely difficult for the Ramaphosa regime to take over and consolidate its power. And in fact, it's not clear that its power is consolidated even as we speak. But the insurrection of the last 2 weeks is then best seen as the consequence or the symptom of a power struggle within the ANC. So it's most likely that the organized portion of the insurrection over the last 2 weeks was aimed at destabilizing the Ramaphosa government, getting it to act in a way that would allow the RET faction to actually oust Mr. Ramaphosa in the NEC, because there's now a well-worn path for regime change, and that is for the NEC to undeploy a president. So both President Mbeki and President Zuma were undeployed by the NEC, and they actually fell in line. So if the NEC were to undeploy Mr. Ramaphosa, there's absolutely no doubt that he would step aside. So the center of power remains the ANC-NEC, and the target of this insurrection was more than likely an attempt to influence the workings of the NEC, and one has to say that it clearly abjectly failed from that point of view. Now, if we look at why did the insurrection go as far as it actually went, the first thing one has to say is that the reason for major bushfires is typically dry tinder, meaning a lot of ready-made fuel for a revolution existed in South Africa. And for a very long time, economic and social commentators have commented on the ridiculously high unemployment levels in South Africa. And now we have to say that in South Africa, we've become used to these extremely high unemployment levels, and we think of it as normal, but it's not. We're the only reasonably advanced middle-income country in the world where unemployment stands at roughly a third of the employable population. And we have to also say that a very large portion of that unemployment is among young people. So one of the extremely worrying things that's coming out is that polls that is being done as to people's attitude towards these riots and looting finds that young people are much more supportive of this than older people. Now, I guess it's always so in any society that young people are more likely to be radical, and therefore that's not really that surprising, but effectively one has to say that any unemployed young person is a ready-made rioter, if you like, and the hungrier you get, the more you would like to actually have a free bout of just actually eating the cake in the spot. The next thing that happened is that on top of that very high structural unemployment level, we've actually had a very draconian lockdown during COVID, which actually was leading to massively increased poverty and hunger. So one of the things that we see worldwide, but definitely in South Africa, is that the pain of the COVID incident is falling disproportionately on poor people. So typically wealthy people are able to get on with their lives. They are able to log into meetings with their wealth managers via Teams or Zoom, and really not much changes, except that it's actually more convenient to work from home than to drive into an office through the traffic. So rich people, not all that affected, but poor people, especially those people working in low-paying jobs, that basically disappeared. So if you think of jobs in the restaurant industry, in the hospitality industry, etc., typically fairly poor people just trying to make ends meet, which have now lost their jobs, and they've been sent home. And when they get home, the government has not effectively intervened to support them in any proper way. So, yeah, definitely something that makes it easy for demagogues to get involved. Then the other thing that we've been seeing in South Africa is a very high level of publicity to high-level corruption. And one has to say it's just been stunning and unprecedented to hear about all of these corrupt activities in the press and in the Zondo Commission, and with very little consequence from a law enforcement position in the short run. Now, it may very well be that the famous Ramaphosa long game is sidelining the criminal faction But effectively, for people on the street, hearing that their leaders have been looting the country, and basically what you have to say is the looting under the Zuma regime has been far worse than the looting by the actual poor people in warehouses and shopping malls. So that certainly undermines the idea that you should be law-abiding. Then, of course, you also have the lack of service delivery. So if you are living in the east of Pretoria, you will be aware that electricity has been very scarce for a while because the Wapatrand substation burned down 2 years ago, and it's only likely to be fixed by 2024, by the way, by the DA Council. So service delivery to normal people has been very weak, and the most obvious example or examples of this has been the complete breakdown of the transport system through Prasa for normal people trying to get into cities to do their work. The fact is that they now have to take expensive taxis because the train system is just not working. And then, of course, load shedding. So lack of service delivery is also a huge frustration for the population at large. And then also the factional differences within the ANC that has been on display publicly. So if you look at the next photograph, you will see people queuing outside a SASSA office, desperately trying to get their hands on a little bit of money to just buy some food. So if you ask those people whether they would like to toddle down to the nearest shopping mall and do a bit of free affirmative shopping, it's not that surprising that they would participate. So effectively, you have to say that the elites in South Africa has been failing the ordinary people in a big way over the last 10 to 20 years. And therefore, the dry tinder for an event like this was clearly in existence. Now, the problem, of course, as always, is that the people who are involved in these things don't necessarily understand that the person on whose behalf all of these insurrections are happening is by far the most responsible person for all of these bad things that have been happening. Clearly, they don't necessarily understand that. So one of the features of South Africa is the fact that people, in spite of very bad circumstances, people keep voting for the ANC. Now, one of the incidents that is just bizarre that we looked at a while ago is that people had to re-register for the COVID-related payouts from SASSA, and when they didn't actually line up far enough from each other for the to the satisfaction of the authorities, they were actually blasted by water cannon in the presence of Minister Lindiwe Zulu, the person responsible for these grants. So the fact that Minister Zulu, after that incident, is still the minister is absolutely bizarre. But so there is a disregard for the suffering of ordinary South Africans at the government level that is actually stunning. Now, what are the consequences of these things? Firstly, the political consequences, and again, we've got a couple of alternatives to pick from. The first is that this is the catharsis. This is now the last little bit of resistance from the looting Zuma faction, and that this gives Cyril Ramaphosa, as the good guy in all of this, the freedom to actually get rid of all of those people in his government that he doesn't want there. We all know that the reason why the first announcement of the cabinet was so slow is that Mr. Ramaphosa, although legally as president, he has the freedom to pick anyone he likes for his cabinet, has been forced to set up a compromise cabinet. does this now free Cyril up to fire everyone in the RET faction and everyone linked to corruption, appoint competent new cabinet members, and start rebuilding the country? So effectively, if you are an editor of a newspaper or a commentator, that's what you are urging Cyril to do. But what we've actually seen in the last 2 weeks is more like the second chance, or the second option, and that is that things don't really change because of this. That the usual suspects, meaning Cyril on the one side and Didi Mabuza and NDZ and a couple of other of those normal suspects, continue to bicker at the top, while government incompetence just continues. And what one has to say about government incompetence, one of Cyril Ramaphosa's own comments, is that one of the things that he completely underestimated when he became president is that lack of implementation capacity in government. And one has to say that if you look at the comment by Trevor Manuel the other day, that the cadre deployment policy is at the root of all the government problems, one can't really differ too much from it. So effectively, what I've always said is that when you see a new appointment, you don't really look at the race or gender of the person that is being appointed. You look at whether this is an appointment for political reasons or for competency. And if you appoint people for political reasons rather than competency, you are likely to actually get a lot of incompetency. And that is what we're seeing throughout our government at all levels, in government-owned organizations, in local government, in the cabinet. Incompetence is rife. Now, one of the big problems in the Zuma era is it wasn't only political, but you also had to be willing to help steal. And therefore, that compounded the incompetence. So in this no-change environment, citizens will continue to fend for themselves as best they can. So for a long time, we've known that you'd better take care of your own children's education, you better take care of your own house's security, you'd better take care of your own medical aid, and so on. But we now know that you had better take care of your own public order as well. The third option, and this is actually 9 out of 10 times political commentators like to say we'll either be on the high road or the low road. But most of the time we actually don't take the high or the low road, we muddle through. So what is the muddle through scenario? Is the Ramaphosa faction is gradually getting the upper hand. So if you had asked me before the last 2 weeks what had been happening in South Africa over the last 6 months, I would have given you a very positive picture of the fact that, first of all, the RET faction is gradually being sidelined, and the ANC has actually taken the courage to sideline Ace Magashule. Isn't it interesting that we've heard nothing from Ace Magashule throughout the last 2 weeks? He was present on the Sunday evening before Mr. Zuma's arrest, and after that we never hear from him again. But we basically have sidelined the front person of the RET faction, and we have the constitutional courage to jail Mr. Zuma. So actually fantastic stuff, except that that now leads to an insurrection. So does this gradual sidelining of the RET faction and the gradual cleaning up of the government, that's also to be seen, for instance, in places like Eskom, etc., does that get the upper hand and slowly start reforming the government? So no dramatic event, just a slow move in that direction. The problem with that slow improvement is that it is virtually indistinguishable from option number 2, that is no change. So it really looks like no change at all. So to a very large extent, what we are most likely to see is this third option. The Ramaphosa faction will gradually get the upper hand, but there will be no dramatic event that sidelines the whole RET faction. So one of the things that I miss in South Africa, as you get older, you start missing things from a previous age. And if you look at that photograph of Nelson Mandela and Cyril Ramaphosa, the thing that I miss is actually not Nelson Mandela so much as the Cyril Ramaphosa that we knew in the 1990s. The strong person who brooked no opposition. So that Cyril Ramaphosa seems to have faded completely, compromise on every level, and patient long game is what we're looking at. So one of the questions we're getting before we go on to the economic consequences of all of this is, what is the difference between a coup and an insurrection? And effectively, a coup is a real attempt to take over the government with a realistic chance of actually succeeding. And that a coup would then be completely taking over the government outside the normal legal channels. So this was not a coup, or it's very unlikely that it will come out that this was an attempted coup. An insurrection basically means that you challenge the authorities and that you challenge the legal structures, but you don't actually have the intention or the ability to take over government. So this looks a lot more like insurrection than a coup, but an insurrection can be instrumental in helping change the political balance at the very top, which then looks a lot more like a coup within the ANC, I guess. But essentially what we have to say is all of these things that's happened is really a symptom of the power struggle within the ANC. If we now just look at the economic consequences of all this, obviously not too many positive consequences. So the first consequence is there's been a massive destruction of assets, and that is likely to lead in the short term to shortages of a variety of things. I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised when I walked into the Spar and I saw a whole rack of fresh bread just after the insurrection. So in Pretoria, bread was never actually a real shortage in spite of some panic buying. In spite of the fact that we were not allowed to buy petrol in canisters, how do you actually, how do they expect you to run your generator during load shedding if you can't buy petrol in canisters? But anyway, no real shortages eventuated basically in any other place than Natal. So in Natal, I believe there has been some shortages of a variety of things. So there will be some shortages and there will be some price hikes because of the scarcity. But actually, surprisingly little up to this point. The second thing is investments are likely to slow down due to the shock to business confidence. So the first thing that you have to say is, what foreigner will now decide to invest his money in South Africa and actually create facilities if there is absolutely no intent or desire from the government to protect that investment? So there's absolutely no doubt that the investment ratio in South Africa will significantly slow down, and investment is the driver of growth in future. So effectively, no doubt that this is very bad news for the investment level in South Africa. Now, if you don't invest and you have lower confidence, this is a shock to the supply system. And any shock to the supply system always leads to both higher inflation and lower growth. So this is a stagflation scenario. So effectively, we are likely to see more stagflation in South Africa because of this. Then, what about interest rates? What about policy? So first of all, this will lead to a worsening of government finances, which is already precarious. So therefore, the government will be able to spend even less on resurrecting the economy, and the government will get in even less in taxes as people make less profit, and people lose their jobs and therefore don't pay tax. But that means that even though inflation will be somewhat higher, interest rates are likely to stay low due to the slow growth in the South African economy. So the current low interest rates very likely to persist for actually much longer than most people expect. So if that's the consequences, what to do for us? Maybe just one last comment. The fact that in this whole process, a lot of people were afraid for their own personal safety will most definitely lead to an acceleration of immigration of skilled workers. So skilled workers in South Africa, for a variety of reasons, slow growth, too much BEE, etc., has been immigrating, and that is likely to accelerate because of this event. Maybe I should just actually give one small comment about what is positive in all of this. And the one big positive is that this could easily have spilled over into very severe racial tension. And the fact that this did not spill over into severe racial tension is extremely good news for South Africa. The fact that this didn't actually play out as a white against black event is phenomenal news for South Africa, and it creates the chance for rainbowism to re-emerge, if you like. So what to do about all of this? The first thing that I would say is by far the most important thing you can do to make yourself safer is to invest some significant money outside of South Africa. So the thing that I would say to you is that if we look around the world at places where governments have dissipated because of the kind of socialism and incompetence and looting that basically looks a lot like the thing that we saw progressively in South Africa over the last 10 to 15 years. So if you look at countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or whatever, if you were a wealthy person living in that country and you had invested a significant amount of money outside the country, you are still living the good life in those countries. So wealthy Venezuelans who have mostly invested outside of Venezuela are actually fine at this point. It's the ordinary workers and the people who have only assets in Venezuela that are being very negatively affected. It's not really the wealthy, but wealthy means if things go wrong, you want to have very significant investments outside the country where things go wrong. And what we have to say is that this incident shows that South Africa was closer to a complete implosion than any of us thought. So significant investment offshore is essential. The second thing is for younger people who haven't already accumulated a lot of money that can be invested offshore, the most important thing is to acquire skills that are in global demand. Now, in easy terms, that means don't go study law, go study accountancy. Because South African accountants are in great demand worldwide, while South Africa is virtually the only country in the world that uses the Roman Dutch law. So if you are a lawyer in South Africa, very difficult to transplant your skills. So when you start to acquire skills, try to acquire skills that you can actually apply elsewhere, because you may at some future point you may want to move along. The So the certainty that we've had up to fairly recently that South Africa would stay a good place to make your living may come under pressure. The one thing that we would have to add to that is the immigration of skills basically means that the remaining skilled people are in bigger demand. So I've met many clients who said that they would never have become as wealthy as they are if it hadn't been for previous immigration of a variety of skilled people from South Africa. So those skilled people that remain will have less competition and therefore will make more money. The other thing that I would say is if you have a lot of money, and this is a real alternative for you, it would be irresponsible not to consider acquiring some citizenship or residency alternative, meaning the ability to leave South Africa temporarily or permanently, if you should choose to do so, is a luxury that is mainly reserved for people with quite a lot of money. But if you happen to have quite a lot of money, I would say that making provision for that would be, or not making provision for that would be irresponsible. So there are a lot of options, and most of these options really turn around money. So again, if you have enough money offshore, there are basically always good ways to go and join your money offshore if you were to consider that an alternative. But effectively, my idea is not that you should emigrate tomorrow, but the idea is that you should put yourself into a position that if you decided to, you should be able to do it at short notice. The other thing, unfortunately, that I have to add is you should be boosting your personal security, meaning you should become significantly more cautious about where you go in South Africa, and also about where you live and where you work. So the idea that you would always be protected by the police or the security forces, not really, I think most of us got a bit of a shock as to how determined the police really were to maintain law and order. So if you have a business or if you have a personal establishment, a house or a flat or whatever, make sure that you are safe. And then, of course, make sure that you have the necessary insurance on your business. So one of my clients actually works in the insurance, short-term insurance industry. And one of his observations is that you can tick the Sastria box at very low cost in your insurance, but a lot of his clients neglect to do so. Tick the Sastria box is really the recommendation. Make sure that you are properly covered because incidents like this may recur. But remember now, this is not an insurrection or an incident where poor people are just rising up and taking stuff from rich people. This is a consequence of the transfer of power within the ANC, and that only happens at long intervals. So an incident like we've seen over the last 2 weeks are very unlikely to recur for many years. But it's not impossible, and therefore you need to actually, from a caution point of view, you need to move on and make sure that you are that you're properly insured. Yeah. I'm basically through my my list of things that that one should look at. I've got a question here. One critical question: who are the candidates to follow Cyril Ramaphosa as president? Complete 2 terms, and then what after that? So I think that one of the biggest worries for those people who believe in a moderate future for South Africa is that there is no obvious successor. to Cyril Ramaphosa. So if you think about the anti-Cyril faction, there's a number of names that comes to mind. But if you look at the successor for Ramaphosa, and we're actually now moving to the point where the end of a 10-year term for President Ramaphosa is starting to come within sight. And so I think that one of the things that he needs to do, and I think up to now he's been more concerned with consolidating his own power than with making sure that there's a proper transfer of power at the end of his term. He needs to anoint a successor. Now, it's not clear at this point who that successor may be. And that is a seriously worrying issue. Hopefully, we get more clarity on that in the next. It's that the moderates in the ANC are currently in the majority. That is why Cyril Ramaphosa is in power. And Cyril Ramaphosa himself is still a very good political candidate. But what they need is a moderate person who is a very good political candidate to follow President Ramaphosa. And there's really no one at this point that seems to be in a position to do that. One of the people that have from time to time looked as if she is coming into play is Lindiwe Sisulu. So you will all know that the Sisulu family are long-standing proponents of the moderate factions in the ANC. And Sisulu was on the Ramaphosa slate during the last election, but she doesn't seem to be on good terms with Cyril himself and making progress to look like a successor. So Sisulu would be one candidate that could be a compromise candidate. Apart from that, the factions people like Trevor Manuel, etc., there doesn't seem to be any real political movement to promote them. So yes, one of the things that I've often said is that South Africa is a country with a problem for every solution. And yes, there is a problem in terms of who will succeed Cyril Ramaphosa. Any other questions or comments? One of the things to say, there is a recording. You can actually log into the recording of this if you want to. Maybe just one more comment from a political perspective. And that is the seeming irrelevance of the EFF during all of this. So if you think of the insurrection as it was very much a Zulu-centered thing. So even though Cyril apologized eventually for calling it ethnic mobilization, what we have to say about this is it was mostly in areas dominated by Zulus, and it was mostly on the back of the Zuma support. So there seems to be very little indication that either Ace Magashuli's Free State support or Didi Mabusa's Mpumalanga support or the EFF's support in Limpopo was to any extent mobilized for this effort. So in fact, what seems to be happening is that as COVID has progressed, the Malema influence have seemed to wane, and the whole EFF presence have seemed to become less important. So the threat posed by the EFF seems to have dissipated for the moment. Now, again, one of the big things that happens is that the ANC up to into power by having more than 50% of the votes at all times, which is actually extremely unusual in a proportionate representation system such as ours. It's actually much more normal for parties to go into coalition. Now, the problem for the ANC is that if they were to go into coalition, just let me have a look at this question. Um, I have a question about how do we actually support the succession of a reasonable person, and how do we support the Ramaphosa faction in terms of consolidating power. Maybe let me just finish the thought about coalition government, and then I'll come back to that. Effectively, one of the problems for someone like Cyril is if there was to be a next election and the ANC has less than 50% of the votes, there are basically two alternatives in terms of coalition. The one alternative is to involve the EFF sharp to the left in order to accommodate the EFF, or the other alternative is that you have to be the DA, and unfortunately the DA in all of this has not been covering itself in glory over the last 5 years. So the DA, in fact, for, let's just say, the rump ANC, the DA might be a disastrous coalition partner. So very difficult to see how the DA becomes extremely popular among black South Africans at this point. So a very difficult choice if they were to go below the 50%. So one of the big reasons why both factions in the ANC are driving hard not to let the ANC actually break up is that for all practical purposes, if they do break up, they may very well lose power permanently. Whereas if they manage to hang together, there's a chance that they might rotate power among themselves. The frustrating thing about politics in South Africa after 1994, I have to say, in answer to the question of how do we promote the better alternatives and the better scenarios, it's very difficult for white South Africans, which is the bulk of my audience today, to influence politics in South Africa in any serious way. So the one thing that I have to say is the CR17 campaign contributions have been kept secret. So those of you who actually gave money to Cyril's election campaign made a positive contribution to South Africa not going down the Venezuela or Zimbabwe path. So maybe let me just conclude by saying that in South Africa, power is not only concentrated in the government, and actually we saw that very much over the last 2 weeks. So even though the government is weak and incompetent, the power in South Africa is actually very widely distributed, meaning civil organizations, NGOs, unions, businesses, etc., also have a great deal of power in South Africa. So for most of my audience, the best contribution you can make is to actually push for business and government to work together to create a better economic future for the country and to basically eradicate some of the poverty and the things that make it easy for people to make the decision to go loot while it's easy. Let me have another look. Okay, from Bruno Schwalbach. Hi, Wikus. Economic question. How, in your view, do we go from where we are to a modern economy which relies on consumer spending for steady growth in the coming decades? The answer to that is that the road to prosperity for most developing countries actually doesn't run through consumer spending. So consumer spending is the mainstay of most developed economies. So an economy like China, for instance, is struggling to transition from an economy driven by investment to an economy driven by consumption. But that's actually something that happens in the later stages of development. The right route for economic development for countries like South Africa is to have an investment-driven economy for multiple decades, because that investment-driven economy is what actually drives economic development and prosperity. So what you actually have to do is you have to start investing in people, investment into people, into power. And the real mind shift that we have to make is that we have to accept that the skill levels of South Africans are such that we cannot actually give them well-paying jobs. So the biggest reason why we have this incredibly high unemployment is we have basically forbidden low-wage jobs from emerging, and therefore all people with low productivity are unemployable in South Africa, and we have to move on from that. We have to create a system where even people who have low productivity at this point can be employed in low-paying jobs and then exposed to a lot of training that enables them to become better paid over time. The question is, do you think that this has weakened Zuma in that he has played his last card and has fewer options? I do think that all of the threats from the Zuma faction, that they will undermine the ANC, and they will either make the country ungovernable, or that they will split off on their own and weaken the ANC, etc., etc. Basically, all of those cards have now been played. So I do think it is the Zuma faction's last card that has been played. But what we have to say is it looks like there's a fairly large kind of uncommitted faction in the ANC. So if you're in the ANC, you're not clearly a Zuma person or a Ramaphosa person. There's a small faction of really dyed-in-the-wool supporters, and I think they've played their last card. But then there's only a small faction of dyed-in-the-wool Ramaphosa supporters. And the large middle portion at this point still seems to remain uncommitted, which is why it seems to me to be unlikely that we'll get a radical solution whereby Cyril now moves on, promotes his own people, and ignores the rest of the ANC. He would still need the bulk of the uncommitted part of the ANC, and a significant part of that is the trade union movement. He would still need to take them along, and the kind of solutions, the kind of free market solutions that we actually understand as economists would be the best solutions for the South African economy are probably not possible without offending that part of the ANC's power base. So what we have to say is, unfortunately, even the best case scenario in South Africa still doesn't say that we suddenly become a completely dynamic country like some of the Eastern countries. We don't become Singapore overnight. We look, unfortunately, a lot more like Brazil. But in Brazil, what we have to say is, one of the examples we have from Brazil is that the ex-president actually served a long term in jail for corruption. So maybe we can go the Brazil route for a while. Any other questions or comments? I think that we've spent our hour. Thank you very much for logging in. Let me emphasize my one overriding recommendation. If you are a South African, two things. You are still much more likely to become wealthy or to become wealthier by pursuing your business in South Africa in the absence of the competition from a lot of immigrants. That's point number one. Point number two, the best way to safeguard yourself against all kinds of negative events in South Africa is to invest a significant portion of your wealth offshore. Even if you don't actually leave South Africa, the fact that you have a large offshore investment safeguards you against 99% of all negative things that might happen. And for most South Africans, and for certainly most people on this call over the last 2 weeks, is there was real safety over the last 2 weeks. And there I would say the very good conclusion from all of this is there's no real animus against white people and no desire to overrun the white suburbs among black South Africans. In fact, the resistance to all of this, to this uprising, has been mostly led by black people and people, for instance, the taxi associations. So again, a sign of the diffusion of power in South Africa. But the lack of animus against white people is actually a phenomenally good conclusion from the last 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Talk to you again about other interesting stuff.